This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. Hi. What do you guys want to talk about? Thanks, guys. Back to you.
I think I figured out why I was so good at sales. Communication. Dear God. Let me just say something right now. To anybody out there that fields phone calls for companies or schedules appointments, word to the wise from somebody like myself that's pretty chill to begin with. I have a lot of patience. But when you tell a customer you're going to call them back to schedule something, don't not call them back. Not only is it a dick move, it's horrible service. Oh, and another thing too, for anybody out there that doesn't like procrastinating, such as myself, don't ever think you have to be in a rush to get your paperwork in order prior to moving out of state. Because evidently you'll be the one waiting for other people to get their crap together. And to think, I relocated solely because I hated living in Pittsburgh all those years. Now I'm not so sure about Ohio. All right, rant done. Now we can talk about wrestling here. It's Friday, so we've got the classic content in store. This is the Five Starr Wrestling Report, the podcast nobody knows but everyone needs. A detox podcast, if you will. If you're one of those disgruntled, frustrated modern fans, and you're just in the market for good content, you ain't getting it with the modern wrestling. So you may as well tune in to hear me talk about classic stuff. Although maybe I should put a caveat on that. Not everything is great. Trust me. Especially the dying days of Crockett Promotions right before the Turner sale. But at least we can have a good laugh along the way. We're about, I would say 3 weeks away from the sale, I believe. God, looking at the timeline, it's hard to imagine that we've made it 2.5 years reviewing NWA on the Superstation. And we're now reaching the end of an era. And by God, there is so much left to talk about, dude. Lord even knows we'll ever cover half of it. We're going to try. We will at least make it a concerted effort to get to the Nitro era. As long as I have breath left in me, can I make it another 10 years? Don't give your hopes up. So I guess you could pinpoint this week as an important milestone in NWA history. Not only because they taped this week's Superstars in the Superstation from Fayetteville, North Kakalaki, we also had an unexpected angle occur. And judging how the execution of it went, I think it's safe to say, did not really give them the results they were intending, which we will shortly discuss. And all the while, their cold open saw Kevin Sullivan being a dick to Rick Steiner again. Out of the goodness of his heart, Steiner went ahead and bought Sullivan a University of Michigan sweater No strings attached. Just wanted to be a good friend. Despite the fact that Sullivan and Rotunda have been dicks to Steiner for weeks. But you know, Steiner's none too bright. He wasn't picking up on visual cues. So as an act to continue to ridicule Steiner, somehow Mike Rotunda caught wind of the fact that Steiner bought Sullivan a team sweater. So Rotunda bought Sullivan a Syracuse sweater of his own, which Sullivan immediately took and completely disregarded Steiner's gift. So, translation, you know, they're still treating poor Rick like the redheaded stepchild of the group. A storyline that's, albeit starting to get a little redundant and repetitive. You know how sometimes there are those storylines in wrestling where they make it so apparent what the end goal is. You're basically just twiddling your thumbs waiting for the end result that you know is forthcoming. But like, it's not something you're patiently waiting to see. It's one of those today junior deals. That's what this varsity club breakup is starting to become. We get it. They want to outlaw Steiner from the group. But God, at this rate, all they're doing is making Steiner look like a dumbass for not realizing it. And this segment did not help his cause. This was extremely campy. Like, bad early 90s WWF campy. But anyway, going back to the big angle that I talked about a minute ago. Now, they kind of let the cat out of the bag from the get-go. The big angle or landmark event that took place recently. For anybody that didn't already know, I'm referring to the Road Warriors heel turn. The heel turn that didn't really stick the landing because, well, as expected, nobody wanted to boo the fucking Road Warriors. But Tony and JR set it up from the beginning, saying that we'd try to get to see the footage later on, or they would dive deeper into the situation. But, spoiler, we did not see the footage. No, the show proper started with an Al Perez, Larry Zbyszko versus Mike Justice, Dave Isley match. And the only reason I did not immediately fast forward here is that I knew the crowd would be lively, given they were in an actual arena with real fans. Didn't make Al Perez any less boring to watch. Again, I still have no fucking clue what the deal with the nunchucks is. Larry's waving around these nunchucks like he's Bruce Lee. Teddy just confiscates them. We never see him again. They don't factor into the finish. All I wrote down about this is Larry and Al do a bunch of wrestling moves and Larry won with a neck breaker. They also still haven't identified the name for Al Perez's airplane spin he does, which is essentially just an airplane spin, except he holds the guy over his head in a razor's edge position. I don't know. I mean, James Storm used to do that move in TNA years ago. I forget what he called it. Same move, though. And then they were at ringside with it for a promo. Gary Hart talked about what makes Al Perez and Larry Zbyszko a formidable tag team. It's because they make frequent tags. I shit you not. That was his explanation. The reason Perez and Zbyszko are the forerunners of winning the U.S. Tag Title Tournament is because they make a lot of tags. And I guess the other teams don't. I have no idea what the hell he was rambling about. I don't think he did either. This sucked. And then we had a rather bizarre segment when we came back from commercial. They got Oliver Humperdinck doing a promo with David Crockett. Meanwhile, in the backdrop, they're basically having a standby match with the Italian Stallion and another guy. I didn't recognize him. But yeah, that match is basically just happening in the back as they pitch to a videotape of Bam Bam Bigelow wrestling a squash match on the Sunday syndicated program. And while Bam Bam is wrestling George South, my brain is asking the obvious question, well, what the hell is happening on the tape show as we speak with the Italian Stallion? Very bizarre. So after Bam Bam wins, they pitch back to Crockett and Humperdinck. I just realized that sounded like a law firm. Crockett and Humperdinck, LLC. Anyway, Humperdinck basically promised the day would come where Ric Flair would have to defend the World Heavyweight title against Bam Bam. And he made a promise to everybody, including David Crockett, that Bam Bam would defeat Flair and become the new World's Heavyweight Champion. And apparently Humperdinck forgot the cardinal rule of wrestling. Never make a promise that a babyface can't keep. And then we come to our featured match for this week's show, which they did advertise the previous week. Nikita Koloff versus Russian Assassin number 2. Still never figured out who worked the Assassin 2 gimmick. I know it wasn't anybody important. Yeah, the fact that this was their advertised main event this week should kind of tell you something about the state of the product here in the fall of 1988. I'm not saying it was bad, just kind of mid. The best part of the segment was Paul Jones going over to Tony and JR at the commentary desk and yelling, "I'm sick of all these NWA officials having 2 sets of rules." Tony and JR are just like, I have no idea what the hell Paul's talking about. And that's what made it funny. Contextually, it made absolutely no sense. Paul Jones tried to run a distraction on the apron as Teddy Long told him to get down. And this angered Paul Jones to the point where he had to vent his complaints over the headsets. Gotta love it when the heels try to stir shit up for no discernible reason. And like all the while, Paul's out there just hitting Nikita in the gut with his riding crop. 2 sets of rules, says the conniving heel manager running interference every 15 seconds. So they come back with Assassin number 2 working over Nikita. A lot of false comeback sequences. And we eventually get the big angle where Nikita hip tosses Assassin number 2 into Teddy Long. Came down right on top of the guy's fucking knees. I don't know how Teddy didn't tear an ACL or something. But while he's down selling, Assassin number 1 hits the ring and immediately eats a Russian sickle. And when Nikita goes over to work Assassin number 1, the other assassin loads up the mask with a fake gimmick. Ends up leveling Nikita with a headbutt. And this leads to the best part of the whole segment. As Paul Jones is trying to revive Teddy to count the pinfall, Ivan Koloff hits the ring, and he starts going after Paul Jones with a chain. And this is just classic Paul Jones overselling to the point where it just becomes hysterical. Ivan's got this chain wrapped around his neck, and he pulls him down to the ground. Paul's eyes are bugging out. He's flailing his arms in the air, trying to grab at anything and everything he can. And the assassins, like complete buffoons, This is the best part. They're trying to pull out Paul from under the ring by his knees. But Ivan's basically got Paul clamped down to the mat with a chain over his throat. At no point do the assassins think, why don't we just get in the ring and pry Ivan off ourselves? That would be easier. No. They continue to pull at Paul's legs for like 5 minutes to no avail. And they're trying to punch Ivan in the back. That ain't doing jack shit. Meanwhile, Paul Jones is dying in front of our eyes. Finally, a bunch of underneath guys file out and help break up the fight. This did end up turning around by the end, mainly due to Paul Jones' selling. The visual of him getting choked out with a chain in the most cartoonish manner imaginable. The classic heel manager oversell. God, it was great. Paul Jones is the best part of the entire segment. I dare say it was equally as great as the follow-up promo with Ivan and Nikita at ringside, where they're screaming and yelling about Paul Jones being a weasel and a coward and a cockroach. This, that, and the other thing. Ivan says that he personally went to the NWA management and brought to their attention the fact that the assassins have been hiding gimmicks under their masks. So from now on, the assassins will be searched prior to every match to ensure they can't hide anything. And Paul Jones will be searched as well, since he's usually the culprit behind the gimmick. And then Nikita basically said something to the effect of, Paul Jones, I don't care, I don't care, I don't care. And then he stuck his tongue out and flexed his biceps for the camera. The single best cop-out in wrestling when you have no idea how to finish your thought. Just flex for the camera and show everybody how big your muscles are. Did wonders for Luger's career. Then we go from that to a super milquetoast Ron Simmons squash with John Savage. Simmons wore his signature Hulk Hogan colors for the occasion. Yellow ring trunks with red knee pads. All he needed was a bleach blonde hair. He would have completed the look. It went 90 seconds and Simmons won with a flying shoulder tackle. Nothing else needs to be said. Then we came back for a Ric Flair promo. He basically told Oliver Humperdinck that his voice is shot from being a little under the weather. So he was going to save his comeback rant until next week. At which point, he then proceeded to rant and scream about how awesome the NWA is. And it was every carbon copy Ric Flair promo you've ever heard. He's the standard bearer of the National Wrestling Alliance. He name drops a bunch of baby faces on the roster. Says they have to beat Flair to prove they're the best. Of course, he makes sure to reference Dusty Rhodes. That's pretty much it. I've about tapped out on trying to recap the same fucking verbiage when it comes to Ric Flair. It's literally the same shit every time. God bless him, but Jesus Christ, dude. And that took us to Eddie Gilbert versus Trent Knight. Did not really occur to me that Eddie Gilbert's been off the show for a while. And I saw him pop up here. I was like, yeah, I guess he has been away for a bit. I mean, I remember he was all over the show late last year, right when the UWF buyout went down. Him and Terry Taylor were one of the big focal points of the program headed into Starrcade last year. Then Taylor went to the WWF and Eddie vanished for months. The announcers brought up how Gilbert and Jimmy Garvin are close friends, which is basically what prompted Gilbert's return. The fact that he was seeking revenge on Kevin Sullivan for attacking Garvin on TV weeks ago and breaking his leg. There was a rather comedic moment in this match where Gilbert tried to pay tribute to Rick Steiner by giving Trent Knight an amateur takedown. It was so unimpressive, it made even Tony Schiavone laugh. Then they wrestled for another minute, which led to Gilbert fucking up his own finish on Trent because he was way too far away from the ropes. So ever the improviser, Gilbert just shrugs his shoulders and he does the move again. Not how you see a very efficient return for Eddie Gilbert. Nor would I classify his follow-up promo as efficient. Mostly in the fact that I had no idea what he was mumbling about for half of it. He was totally blown up from the previous match. All I know is he mentioned something about Jimmy Garvin, so that he was planning to go after the Varsity Club. He'd never claimed to be the strongest or the most athletic wrestler in the world, but he's definitely the smartest. And, yeah, it was really odd here. They seemed to imply that the intended feud was going to be Rick Steiner and Mike Rotunda versus Eddie Gilbert and Jimmy Garvin. Or maybe even Mike Rotunda and Kevin Sullivan versus Eddie Gilbert and Jimmy Garvin. Since we already know Rick Steiner's turning face soon. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm trying to remember this. Garvin doesn't come back to the NWA until the reboot of the Freebirds in '89 with Hayes, right? I don't recall seeing Jimmy Garvin back in the NWA prior to the Freebirds run. So, I mean, did they have plans to bring back Garvin before all that went down and it just never panned out? I mean, there must have been some kind of contract dispute going on. Because when you really think about it, and this is where the retrospective analysis brings to light all the unconnected dots with storylines over the years, nobody ever really talks about this, but we never did really get a payoff to Kevin Sullivan breaking Jimmy Garvin's leg with a cinder block, did we? Like, they shot the angle on TV. Garvin was off TV for the remainder of the year selling. Then he comes back later in '89 as a member of the Freebirds. I don't think they ever mentioned anything about the Varsity Club incident when he came back. They certainly didn't involve him and Eddie Gilbert in any major capacity. I just realized how incomplete this whole storyline is. But I guess it really wasn't uncommon throughout wrestling history, was it? Remember the infamous blackmail envelope with Baby Doll and Dusty last year? Exactly. Then we had the Sheepherders versus Tommy Angel and Kurt Thompson. The match that I determined may be still going on to this day. I don't even know if that old building is still standing to this day. If it isn't, somewhere underneath all that rubble, the Sheepherders are still wrestling this fucking match with Tommy Angel and Kurt Thompson. Seriously, this went on forever. I think I fell asleep like 3 times while it was still going on. Nothing happened. It was the usual Sheepherder squash. They went over with a double gutbuster. At least they mildly turned it around in their promo afterwards, which was just tremendously bad in every conceivable way, which is what made it so great. So, the Sheepherders are out there doing their thing. I know I often neglect talking about Rip Morgan a lot of the time. Usually he's just there being wacky and not really adding much of anything. He's waving the flag around, which is fine. I could not stop watching him here, though, because while Butch is doing this promo, Rip is standing behind Luke, basically stroking his head and sticking his tongue out like a total creep. Fucking Lucas sounded like a dog, like tilting his head back and looking all excited. I was like, what is going on here? And I think they were talking about the U.S. tag title tournament. All I remember is there's a moment here where Butch screams, "Never!" right in Tony's face. And he doesn't really know how he's going to finish his thought. So he repeats the phrase again. Tony just interjects with, "Never." Only in the subtle way that Tony Schiavone knows how to react. God, they were keeping Tony off camera as much as possible here. Guarantee he was laughing the whole way through. They ended up calling everybody Yankees, including Tony, who just responded with, "Even me." Tony was rarely offended on this show. I think this was the point where he realized, yeah, this company's absolutely fucked. This segment, yeah, not any of the other ones. This is where the balloon was off the rose. This was peak Nitro. Tony does not give a fuck, and he is here to pick up a paycheck. Then coming back, we have the Varsity Club out at ringside doing a follow-up interview of what Eddie Gilbert said earlier on. And it was basically a setup so they could replay the footage from last month when they broke Garvin's leg with a cinder block at the Atlanta studios. And, this is funny. After Sullivan spent like 2 minutes wanting to talk about Jimmy Garvin and Eddie Gilbert, then he's like, "You know what? I don't want to talk about Jimmy Garvin or Eddie Gilbert. I want to talk about how awesome Mike Rotunda is." And they basically steered the entire conversation over to Mike Rotunda, literally so Steiner could interrupt, poke fun at the fact that Sting had him beat in their most recent TV title match. Naturally, this angered Sullivan and Rotunda. So as they're walking away, Steiner just goes, "Yeah, Sting had him beat. I know it." I mean, on the one hand, you could simply view it as Steiner just pulling Rotunda's leg and trying to get a laugh out of him. It was all in good faith. But on the other hand, maybe Steiner's not as much of a dolt as we're led to believe he is. Perhaps he's starting to plot his revenge plan. Well, I'll tell you what, it set the stages for their tag match against Gene Ligon and Joe Cruz. They were already at each other's throats before the bell even rang. So Rotunda's hot. He's giving Steiner all these really hard tag slaps that echo throughout the building. Steiner's just trying to have some fun out there. There's a point where Sullivan calls Steiner over to basically rescind his comments from earlier when he mentioned that Sting nearly beat Rotunda in their last match. Of course, Steiner had to play along. I mean, I'll say this. And this goes back to my earlier comments when I talked about how this storyline is starting to wane in terms of repetitiveness. I at least see why they're prolonging the breakup for as long as they have been. Because every time they have Steiner out there engaging with Rotunda and Sullivan, he gets more and more over as a babyface. The pops are becoming clear with each passing week. And like even here, after Rotunda got the pin at the very end, Steiner comes in and stands in front of him and tries to hog the spotlight. He instantly got Steiner babyface pops. So even if I'm starting to get a little bored in terms of the week-to-week progression of the feud, it is getting over with the fans. So I can't say it's not working. And then they even seamlessly transition into Sullivan's match with Bob Emery after break. And they tried to boot Steiner to the back while Rotunda hung out at ringside. But Steiner decided to hang around and watch anyway. Led to the spot early on where Steiner helped Emery back into the ring while Sullivan was trying to chase him around ringside. And this all eventually boils over to where Sullivan calls Steiner over and he slaps him right over the face, which immediately prompted Steiner chants throughout the venue. Deafening chants. And we see that 1,000-yard stare between Steiner and Sullivan. God, that was very tense. So, I mean, this was probably the week where they went above and beyond to try to facilitate that breakup without officially pulling the trigger. The fans are pretty much 99% in Steiner's camp now. Just a matter of waiting to see how they pay off the angle. When does Steiner have enough? Then he finally gives Rotunda and Sullivan their earned receipt. So shifting gears here, the announcers killed about a minute of airtime by talking about how they're trying to get a word with Dusty and Sting and the Road Warriors to get to the bottom of the incident that went down. But nobody wants to talk. So instead, they pitched over to David Crockett for a Ron Simmons interview. And at first I was like, ugh, this is probably going to suck. Actually, it was a damn fine promo. It was the first time in a long time we've heard Simmons cut a promo that wasn't just a plain Jane white meat babyface promo. Now, he talked about how he's pissed off right now because a lot of his so-called friends or people he thought he could trust are showing their true colors. And where Ron comes from, friendship means everything. And when you break that bond, it becomes personal real quick. He doesn't agree with a lot of things that are happening in the NWA right now. But when the dust finally settles, at least it'll give Ron perspective of where people stand in terms of their current alliances. And you know, it actually kind of makes sense. Considering that Ron's only been around the NWA for about a year. You know, he's had time to see who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, claim his friend groups. And the Road Warriors' turn was something that nobody ever expected, including the boys. Everybody's caught off guard. So it's kind of a shock to the system where Ron doesn't really know who to trust. The people that he thought he could trust the most are now turning their backs on longtime friends. So yeah, he's obviously going to be pissed off about it. So this is good. You know, I appreciated that we saw a little more heated side of Ron Simmons for a change. And that took us to this J.J. Dillon interview after break. First, he covered the Sting Road Warrior situation. Said Sting basically got what was coming to him. Then he explained how Crockett's been trying to get Barry Windham to put his U.S. title on the line against Dusty, but JJ refuses to sign the contract. He'll sign a contract for Barry to wrestle anybody else, but not Dusty. And the reason? Well, he didn't give one. He's an asshole. That's the explanation. Which is not out of the realm of what you would expect coming from a J.J. Dillon. Nah, Barry's not going to wrestle Dusty for the title. Just because. Then we had Dick Murdoch versus Agent Steel, which was surprisingly uneventful per Dickie Murdoch standards. I was kind of disappointed. They put him in the ring with another masked jobber, but he didn't utilize the gimmick as part of the match. Instead, he just beat up Steel for a couple minutes and won with a brainbuster. Well, to be fair, he had a lot on his mind. Road Warrior's heel turn and all. And he did try to make that clear in his promo after the break. Even though it sounded like he was cutting this promo through one of those CV radios from a submarine. What the hell is going on with the audio here? It's horrible. He talked about how when you sign up to participate in a sport, you can expect injuries. And when you get attacked by somebody or a group of people, you can expect to get up and go after those same people that jumped you. When it comes to the Road Warriors, they made a lot of enemies now, and Murdoch is one of those enemies. When he and Dusty get the chance to stand across the ring from him, it'll be a fight that the Road Warriors wish they never picked. There's a pretty straight-to-the-point Captain Redneck promo. No bells and whistles here. I'm really hoping we actually get to see Road Warriors versus Texas Outlaw footage. I know we're yet to come across the infamous Spike angle. Maybe that's where it all goes down. I can't remember. I'd definitely like to see Hawk and Animal lock horns with Captain Redneck, though. That would be fucking awesome. Then we had the Midnights taking on Gary Royal and George South. During this match, they started plugging the Midsouth tour coming up in about a week. And the big news bulletin is that the Midnights are scheduled to wrestle the Road Warriors for that tour, which kind of pits them in a weird heel versus quasi-heel scenario. Even if the Midnights are effectively babyfaces now, I just take it for granted. But I thought that was interesting. And I didn't really think about it much prior to the news here. You know, they've been promoting the Midnights and the Road Warriors as the main tag team feud. Obviously, we haven't seen them start the tease with Paul Lee and the original Midnights yet. So this is kind of like a weird buffer zone they're in again. Kind of similar to how the Midnights were earlier this year, right before the Fantastics came in. Remember back in like January and February, there was like nobody for the Midnights to feud with? So they just kept getting put in singles matches. It's another kind of weird scenario happening in the fall. You know, the Midnight Express are the World Tag Team Champions. Tully and Arn left the promotion unexpectedly, but they didn't have anybody lined up for them to feud with at this point. I liked how they let Cornette basically run down the local live events. And then JR and Tony just sat back and listened. Really nothing to say about the match. Midnights won with the double flapjack. Fine. Nothing overly exciting. And the follow-up promo wasn't much better. Just JC continuing the conversation about the Road Warriors. Basically compared them to something of a 2-ton elephant steamrolling through a brick wall. They're big, bad, and strong then. But then they come into contact with a swarm of killer bees, and they find themselves on their backs kicking and screaming. That's what the Road Warriors are going to look like after they find themselves across the ring from the Midnights. On their backs, kicking and screaming. Sure. We'll go with that. Not one of Corny's finer promos. And they did show us partial footage of the Sting incident, which is basically him just getting carted off on a stretcher. But they told us next week we would see the entire tape to get a better understanding of what exactly happened. So it's a good teaser. You know, I think the show was mainly centered around the angle involving the Varsity Club. They did a fine job with the Russians feud too, but the Rick Steiner stuff was the focal point by and large. You know, not a remarkably great show or anything, but again, I always talk about how I like when they get out of the TBS studios and they tape these shows from bigger venues in front of hot crowds. Yeah, they're still primarily squash matches, but they're more engaging. Although I will concede, you know, this didn't have the 1986 or 1987 levels of crowd investment. They were into some stuff, but they were not hot for that entire 2-hour period. And that was very telling. Like, you go back and watch those old tapes from a couple of years ago. I mean, the fan reactions were the best part of the whole show. By this point in 88, it was very obvious that the steam was not there. And that really stood out listening to the crowd reactions. I mean, aside from the Steiner chants, they were not as lively. And unfortunately, that sets a bad precedent for the new regime, because it did not get better from here. So I think the $1 million word for Midsouth this week was unusual. That seemed to be the descriptor that Bill Watts and Boyd Pierce were explaining the situation that occurred prior to this week's taping. What wound up being the central story for the week. And a rather unique one. Honestly, you could just go ahead and title this week's show, Expect the Unexpected. So here's basically what we had going on. Out of the goodness of his cold-blooded heart, North American champion Butch Reed decided that he was going to put up his North American title on the line against a selection of 4 opponents: Crusher Darso, Magnum TA, Hacksaw Duggan, and JYD. But there was a catch. He was also scheduled for a tag match against Duggan and TA for the Mid-South tag belts, obviously teaming with Jim Neidhart. And the idea here being Butch Reed would defend his North American title first, and if there was TV time remaining in the program, then they would do the tag match. So, to immediately answer the obvious question people are asking, why the hell would Butch Reed, the top heel, willingly defend his North American title on TV when he doesn't have to? Well, it's a good question. But there's a caveat to the title defense. Regardless of who the crowd picked, since that was part of the initial clause, the fans would get to pick Reed's opponent. Turns out it wasn't that simple, because after the crowd almost unanimously picked Dog as the opponent, well, then we get a pre-taped interview with him and Bill Watts, where Reed basically disqualifies Dog, Duggan, and Darso as credible challengers. The best of which was Darso, where he flat out just said, point blank, and I quote, "He's too green." Well, I guess I can't argue with that logic. Which basically left Magnum TA as the only suitable remaining opponent. And obviously the whole thing was a cold, calculated plan on Reed's part to manipulate the fans and Grizzly Smith. Because even Reed pointed out the contractual deal, regardless of who the fans picked here as Reed's opponent, he would have the final say. So, fuck the fans. That was the overall message. Now, of course, we'll talk about what happened in just a sec. A pivotal turning point, actually, on Mid-South television. Now, they laid out a lot of information from the beginning here. There was a lot to digest in a 10-minute window. I guess the only thing that sticks out to me, the logic gap, if you want to call it that, why did it matter what title match went on first? Okay, so, Butch Reed swerved the fans and basically admitted that their votes don't count, because Reed was going to pick Magnum TA anyway, the guy he already beat on television a couple weeks ago. But why was it necessary that Reed defend the North American title first? I mean, if you think about it, it actually would have probably made more sense for Reed to defend the North American title after the tag match. That way, if they were down to a time crunch, he could just go, oh shit, we're out of time. Guess that title match won't happen this week after all. Oh well, gosh darn it. But they explicitly said here, Reed wants to defend his title first, so the people don't get the impression he's a paper champion. Which, like, I mean, from his point of view, who the fuck cares what the people think? Right? Yeah, that part, I didn't really get that. Didn't really seem to make a lot of sense to me. But then again, we haven't talked about what happened in the tag title match, so I might be getting a little ahead of myself here. Before we get to the title match here with Reed and Magnum, they had a tag match with Art Cruz and Tom Stanton against George Weingroff and King Cobra. I believe King Cobra was a regular on Memphis television in '83. I don't think we've seen any footage of him in Midsouth throughout the review series. But Watts did say here that he's been in Midsouth, but it's been a while since we've seen him. So, I don't know. Maybe we did review a King Cobra match at one point and I totally forgot. I seem to recall reviewing some of his work in Dallas, but maybe I'm thinking of somebody else. Regardless, I mean, Watts basically admitted that he didn't give a fuck about the match because he was still fixated on what happened with Butch Reed in the previous segment. It's hard to argue against that. It's a fine little prelim match, but mostly just void filler. Cobra and Weingroff did some double team spots at the end with Stanton. And while Weingroff had him in the abdominal stretch, he turned it into a cradle pin as Cobra went to cut off Cruz. So, it was there. Decent match, but nobody gave a shit. It was mainly a standby so Reed could go ahead and prepare for his match with Magnum ahead of time. Not entirely sure what 5 minutes of preparation would have done in the grand scheme of things. Given the result in the match, didn't really do jack shit. And on a show filled with hotshot booking and swerves galore, the swerves keep a-coming. So, right before they start the match, well, first they tease that Magnum wasn't going to come out, but he does end up answering the challenge. And then prior to the opening bell, we see Grizzly Smith flag down Johnny Martinez, the official, telling him to hold up because Grizzly went to the Louisiana State Athletic Commission and got a special guest referee assigned to call the match. None other than the Junkyard Dog. Since Butch Reed thought he pulled a fast one over the company. Well, Grizzly pokes his head in the back door and says, "Up yours, Hacksaw. Here's JYD to officiate." So as you might expect, he blows a gasket. And now all of a sudden, that confidence in Hacksaw Reed is pretty much null and void. Now he's got two opposing threats standing across the ring from him. And that actually throws his game off for the entire match. You know, even when he had the advantage over Magnum during the heat, he's constantly getting in Dog's face, taking his eye off the ball and being way too confrontational. And, I mean, you can clearly see what they were setting up here. You know, all throughout the match, Dog's basically leaving himself in prone position during all the pin attempts for somebody to get pressed on top of him during a kick out. I mean, he did it like every time Reed or Magnum would go for a pin, getting as close as humanly possible to them to make sure he was in position. And so eventually Reed gets launched on a Dog. And they follow that with another bump where Magnum accidentally collides with Dog. So they both go down. So Dog's down selling briefly. Reed tries to come off the top to illegally hit Magnum. But the first time it happens, Dog sacrifices himself by taking the blow for Magnum. And while Reed still has control of the situation, he goes up top again. But this time, Dog has it scouted. After being jacked around for the entire match, just overall fed up with all of Reed's bullshit, as Reed comes off the top of the flying shoulder block, Dog gives the old stiff punch and knocks him out cold. And this is kind of a classic Midsouth moment here. Great camera work from the hard cam side, where they zoom in all the way and you can see Dog howling and snarling at Butch Reed. Boom, boom. Magnum takes advantage. Belly to belly on Reed. 1, 2, 3. New North American champion. Crowd absolutely nutted themselves on the title change too. Yeah. Very cathartic payoff to everything we previously saw in the first 10 minutes of the show. Butch Reed was intentionally trying to fuck over the fans, promising they get to pick his opponent when, in actuality, he was going to decide his opponent anyway. It all blew up in his face. He thought he was so clever with that plan he tried to lay out. Turns out the Mid-South team was just a little bit ahead of him. One step ahead the whole way. And the heel was thwarted. It's exactly what you want to see happen. So this is all done perfectly. And last week we talked a little bit about the lull period here in the fall of '83. However, since that loser leaves town match between DiBiase and Duggan, the shows have kind of been mundane. You can kind of see Bill Watts shuffling around for ideas and just trying to figure out what direction to go with the company at this point. And the concept of hotshot booking usually comes with a lot of negative connotation for wrestling fans, especially in today's climate, where everything is crash TV and immediate gratification. Fans are way too impatient because they want shit now. This is one of those examples in wrestling where I think you can argue that hotshot booking is kind of necessary. I mean, you're coming off a period of like 2 or 3 months where business is down. You need to try to spice it up a little bit, get people talking more. I mean, this is definitely one of those title switches where you could say, yeah, that'll get people talking. I mean, think about it too. Mad MTA's been around for what? Some like 5 months? Still at this stage, he's the younger, newer kid on the block in terms of where he stood in the hierarchy of talent. Definitely wasn't on a Duggan or a DiBiase or a JYD level of star power by this point. And obviously he would grow and develop, but he was still young. And while granted, you probably couldn't book something like this in today's culture without receiving a shit ton of backlash for it. But this absolutely worked for the execution of the Mid-South fans. And because of the story they set up beforehand, the fans were already pissed off that Reed tried to dissuade their vote. It wasn't just a random title switch they did to shock everybody. There was kind of a comeuppance factor for everything that came into play in the first 10 minutes. So this is all well done. But again, we weren't done with Hacksaw Reed, because he had another crucial segment later in the program. So after that point, they kind of simmered things down momentarily with a Nikolai Volkov get-over match. I almost called him Nikita. Force of habit. But yeah, he wrestled Mike Reed. Pretty much dominated him. Went over with a backbreaker. My only comments about this segment were hearing Bill Watts openly call out the Russian government and talk about how their only belief is in the state of communism. The fact that the Russian regime doesn't fear God. That they put themselves above God. It's all about the motherland. You know, some tells me Watts would have really loved Solzhenitsyn's writing. And or Dostoevsky. It was not uncommon for Watts to get very political on this program. I think it's safe to say he made the right call getting the hell out of the professional wrestling business when he did. Because by God, if he saw the state of where things are at today, I don't even want to know what Watts would say. Like, all you'd have to do is tell him that everything's egalitarian 50-50 split between men and women's segments. Pretty sure he'd just walk in the other direction and wouldn't even give it a second thought. For the record, I don't disagree with him. And then we had the debut of Leaping Lanny Poffo to the Mid-South area. Good old Lanny Poffo. Coming down from that outlaw promotion ICW that his father founded in the late 70s. Rivaling Nick Goulas and Jerry Jarrett and several other key promoters that I'm not thinking of at the moment. And now he's finally stepping over that forbidden line and entering other territories. Not necessarily the ones that his family was rivaled with. But I think this was around the point where Lanny started to kind of see the writing on the wall with ICW. He needed an exit plan because the promotion was about to fold. Now, Lanny would become a regular in Mid-South for most of '84. Then obviously he would go to the WWF where he got saddled with the dumbest gimmick of all time. The Genius. Of course, that was later on. I think he actually kept his name for the first couple years he wrestled for Vince. Then they repackaged him later on. I actually saw the footage of Lanny Poffo in Mid-South long before I ever saw his WWF stuff. What a great athlete, though. Seriously, dude. That guy was tremendously talented in the ring. I mean, obviously with a nickname like Leaping Lanny Poffo, you'd expect the guy to be quick on his feet. He was just so seamless with everything he ever did. The way he'd do that kip up and then immediately go right into an arm drag or a drop kick spot. And he wasn't a big guy, granted, but he was still well over 230 pounds, right? It's not like we're talking a Rey Mysterio-sized athlete. And I would still argue, people brought it up in conversation, I would say his work was equal to, if not better than, Randy's. Oh, yeah, by the way, in case people didn't already know that, Randy Savage, Randy Poffo, yeah, they were brothers. I know I didn't make that clear up front. Kind of figured people already knew that. I take a lot of things for granted. I probably shouldn't assume. There's always new listeners. But yeah, fun squash. Simple little enhancement match to get him over with the audience. And we'll be seeing plenty more of him yet. And now we're going to circle back to the Hacksaw Reed story of the week. The second main part of this week's program. And now that Magnum TA is the reigning North American champion, Hacksaw Reed's got an even bigger chip on his shoulder. But it's now time for the Mid-South Tag Title Showdown. Duggan and TA defending against Neidhart and Reed. And you probably thought in the back of your head, it's almost too good to be true to think that Hacksaw Reed would drop 2 straight falls in one show. Well, unfortunately, you will be disappointed to hear Reed did not drop 2 straight falls. You know, overall the match is okay, but that's not really the point. After we had the 4-way breakdown at the end, there's all the usual pandemonium going on that we come to expect with these high-profile Mid-South main events. But they do the deal where Neidhart gives TA the fireman's carry drop. And they already had done the spot where Duggan and Reed went for stereo shoulder blocks. So Duggan was already on the floor selling. And while Johnny Martinez was distracted picking his nose or something, Reed comes off the middle rope with a flying shoulder block on Magnum. And since he was still the legal partner at the time for the heels, he ends up scoring the victory on Magnum. So now immediately the hardcore fans chime in and say, "Oh my God, 50-50 booking. It's so cliche. It's so bullshit." Okay, I will admit, I probably would have liked the idea better of seeing Magnum pin Reed again. But obviously they're trying to establish Reed and the Anvil as a top heel team in the region. You know, they had their first match last week as a team, so you couldn't just beat them here the following week. Elsewise, you'd be cutting their balls out from under them. But again, going back to the whole subject of the show this week, the hotshot booking theme. They're trying to get people talking and leaving a lot of open-ended questions to get people to tune into the following show. And let's be honest, the Magnum-Duggan pairing has kind of been played out. I mean, my running joke with the show for the longest time has been, I totally forgot the fact that those two are still even a tag team. Remember there was that period where Duggan was feuding with DiBiase and Akbar, and Magnum TA was just randomly paired with Dr. Death for several weeks? And I kept asking, are he and Duggan still technically the Midsouth Tag Team Champions? Or did they just drop that whole thing? I seriously wasn't sure because we never saw them teaming together. So I was okay with the title change. You know, at least Reed and the Anvil are a fresh team that we know they're pushing. And pretty soon we'll see Wrestling 2 come in and they'll end up sticking him and Magnum together. So there is a direction they're going. I think here they were just trying to wipe the slate clean and start over with a new set of new champions. So in that vein, I can't fault Watts for the decision here. And that led us to King Kong Bundy and Crusher Darso with approximately 90 seconds left of TV time. So immediately I figured they weren't going to have a televised finish here. They at least built up suspense in the last 30 or so seconds after Darso gave Bundy the big body slam. Had a couple visual near falls on him, but just couldn't keep him pinned down long enough. Really not much more to say other than that. They did plug midgets next week. Watts was super eager to talk about the midgets. Politically incorrect, I know. It was the 80s. Again, though, man, I cannot put over how awesome this show was. I mean, it really boiled down to one primary match, but the execution of it was superb. And just briefly going back to what I said earlier, everything that led up to that title change, both title changes, in fact, I think it was a necessary booking call. We've had a few months go by where the shows have been very stagnant. We've kind of needed a bit of a shakeup in terms of the direction of the product. And this helped to facilitate that. Now, granted, it's not like they immediately turned the company around and they started doing record business as a result of everything that happened on the show here. But you can see Watts trying out some new things and getting the company going in a good direction again. They've been on a downward trajectory ever since DiBiase left the territory. And as we close out 83 and start going into 84, you'll see how Watts fundamentally changes his perspective on not just the booking, but even the talent that he starts to feature at the top of the card. We've seen a slow influx of smaller, more athletic guys. Watts isn't over-relying on the dog as much as he used to. I mean, he's still factored into key parts of the show, but there's a little bit of a shift happening at this point with Mid-South. And you're seeing it in real time. Signs of improvement. Really, really good show. All right, here we go. Cotton Bowl, round 2. Let's barrel through this. Last week, we didn't really have much worth mentioning outside a couple bullet points involving the Fantastics and Sunshine. This week, however, we saw a couple more featured bouts that they advertised for the card. Well, one featured bout, which I believe was one more than last week. I did go over the figures last week, though, so if you want a general idea of how they did in terms of attendance, you can go check out last week's podcast. 26,000 for the record. A major uptick compared to the first year they did the Cotton Bowl, which I think was somewhere around 12,000 in that ballpark. God, that is still amazing to me, considering this card was so lackluster on paper, but they overly doubled their attendance this year. I have no idea how. And oh boy, speaking of lackluster cards, doesn't get any more dreary than opening things up with a Kelly Kiniski match. And since I knew nothing about Tommy Montana, beyond the fact that he kind of looked like a 1983 version of Tim Horner in Midsouth with the creepy-looking porn stash, I basically just figured this was a squash enhancement for Kiniski. Only it wasn't a squash. They actually gave this thing like 10 fucking minutes. They may as well have just wrestled this match in an empty building, because that's what it sounded like the entire time. That's almost mind-blowing, dude. To think they had over 20,000 people in attendance for this thing. Not a soul reacted to anything that happened in this match. And why would they? A cold match featuring Kelly fucking Kiniski. Given time. Fans are probably having more fun picking at their fingernails. Actually, no joke. There were fans audibly making bird noises at one point. Or some kind of whistling noise. I don't even know what you'd call it. I mean, they did have Gene Kiniski out there to cheer on his son. I guess more like serving as a heat magnet. Helping him cheat a couple times behind Rick Hazard's back. Playing coach. Didn't make the people care anymore about the action. But it was good to see Gene. Actually, you know what, I saw him here. It kind of got me thinking. I'm surprised they never involved him on TV more with Kelly. Would have given Kelly a lot more flavor as a personality. So anyway, boring match. Kelly Kiniski sucks. I mean, he worked over this Tommy Montana guy for like the entire match and eventually went over with a backbreaker. After Tommy Montana kicked out at 3.1. And I think Hazard was a little unsure if it was the actual finish, but he called for the bell anyway. I have to assume this was taped first on the card as people were still filing into the building. I mean, this barely would have passed as a dark match in my book. I'd have put this on as a standby while people were filing out to use the bathroom during intermission if I were booking this on a card. Kelly Kiniski's up, folks. Take your piss breaks now. Or go get a hot dog. Then we came back for Brian Adias defending the Texas Heavyweight title against Jack Victory. We also had Gary Hart out there as Victory's mouthpiece. Mouthpiece, manager, same difference. You know, again, really not much to say about this one either. I mean, it was a title match, but didn't really have a lot of heat going in. The fact that Gary was out there led you to believe he was going to factor into the finish somehow. Unless I'm blind, I don't ever recall Gary Hart managing Jack Victory on a frequent basis on television. It kind of followed the pattern of a lot of standard Dallas TV matches. Jack Victory was the heel, so he fed for Adias early on. A lot of stalling on the floor while Hart was talking strategy with him and or feeding him spots. And as Victory got to cut off Adias and work him over temporarily for the heat, Adias made his comeback, ended up getting Victory in a series of spinning toe hold sequences. And this was actually kind of funny with the way they did the finish. Gary Hart screaming, "Don't give up, Jack! Don't give up!" And you see Adias keep applying this hold on several rotations. Finally, Jack Victory just passes out from the pain, and Adias gets the win via pinfall. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, well, he didn't quit. Gary got what he wanted. Probably should have been a little more specific there. Like, break free, motherfucker. Grab the ropes. Come on, Gary. You should know better as a manager. Got to be more specific. Again, like I said, fine little match. But it didn't really come across like a match that belonged on a Texas Stadium card. And while, yeah, the crowd was a little more into this one than they were the Kelly Kiniski match. It's not like they were bouncing up and down in their seats at the sight of it. You know, and Brian Adias is usually somebody that's massively over with the fans. Before we talk about the main event this week, I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't quickly mention last week's angle with Sunshine and Missy Hyatt, along with all the drama involving the great Kabuki. And I'm not going to break down everything verbatim because we already covered everything last week. But they did replay the Kabuki heel turn of sorts. And if you remember, Kabuki wrestled a match with Mark Lewin, and after he lost, they shot an angle post match where Gary Hart tried to get involved and have his guys beat up on Kabuki. But it was Scott Casey that ran in to help him out. And then completely out of the blue, Kabuki went into a feat of rage and started targeting Casey. Jesus Christ, I can't talk. Had a stroke there for a second. But, yeah, Kabuki beat up Casey. And there's a lot of uncertainty as to what prompted the attack. Poor Sunshine ran the full gamut of emotion. You know, she's all smiles one minute and then breaking down into hysterics the next. Did a phenomenal job, though. She really was the main talking point of last week's show, especially coming out of that angle with Missy Hyatt. But, you know, we'll still have to wait and see the next set of tapings to get an idea of what's going on with both those stories. And that takes us to the tape fist match here on this week's main event. It is the Iceman versus the One-Man Gang. As Mark Lorenz set up here in the intros, there are 10 3-minute rounds with 45-second intervals between each round. Basically pro wrestling's version of a boxing match without explicitly calling it a shoot. I guess I could have just called it a worked boxing match. I don't know what's going on, dude. My brain is not functioning at the moment. I apologize. I'm very exhausted right now. So, okay, with that all in mind, the fact that we're basically watching a glorified boxing stipulation, doesn't really make for the most exciting environment. And I've been pretty open on this channel about my overall ambivalence when it comes to MMA or boxing as a sport. I understand there are ties to pro wrestling with some of the athletes that come into the business. There are definitely MMA styles that bleed into pro wrestling. You know, one of my favorite guys to watch several years ago, before he went to AEW and got completely booked into oblivion, I used to love watching Kyle O'Reilly's matches. Like the way he would cross-tie MMA and pro wrestling together. I always loved watching his stuff because it was so innovative and so unlike what everybody else was doing. You know, he's not a fucking trampling cowboy like everybody else. You know, Matt Riddle, same thing. Even though I understand he wasn't everybody's cup of tea. Like, there are ways to incorporate mixed martial arts into wrestling and have it work. On general principle, I just kind of find the sport of boxing and MMA kind of boring. It's just not for me. I've tried to watch it. I've ordered a couple UFC pay-per-views back in the day. Just never liked it. So with that in mind, I can't really say that I enjoyed this because it was basically like watching a glorified boxing match. They tried to incorporate a little bit of wrestling psychology in there with Gang taping cheap shots of the Iceman trying to rally comebacks and get the crowd invested. Problem is, because of the time crunches on the rounds, everything didn't really flow all that seamlessly. I think for a lot of younger fans too, they always associate tape fist matches with more of those Japanese death-style matches where the guys would tape up their fists and then dip them into glue and crush glass, basically treating it as a hardcore match. I've seen those matches before, and I think they usually do just call it a tape fist match, but that's not what this was. Thank fucking God. But they end up going 3 rounds. Gary Hart tried to pass off a roll of coins for Gang to use, but the Iceman cut him off. And while Bronco was dealing with Gary Hart on the floor, the Iceman gave Gang the loaded shot to the head with a coin gimmick. Meanwhile, Kerry Von Erich was wrestling with Gary on the floor. Yet again, the biggest pet peeve on this fucking show right now, Gary Hart not selling a goddamn thing. Still pisses me off. It's like right in front of the camera, dude. God. I love Gary Hart, for the record, but he had a reputation for doing this. And I'm trying to remember what happened at the end here. I think the Gang got counted out. It was not clear based on the way they shot it with the camera angle, but I think Gang just didn't beat the count. So the Iceman won. And, you know, again, a little bit of pro wrestling booking in there. The last few minutes were okay. The rest of it was just kind of blasé. I guess if you're a boxing fan, you might enjoy it a little more than I did. I mean, you could probably spend the entire time poking holes in all the flaws with how they broke the rules of standard boxing matches, such as the Iceman trying to give Gang a double axe handle off the middle rope. Pretty sure that wouldn't fly under normal MMA rules. Clever idea in theory for a match. In execution, kind of fell flat. But that is just my opinion. You know, we're still waiting to see the hair match with Gino and Chris against the Von Erichs. That is kind of the main story for the entire Texas Stadium card. So hopefully they air that next week. Again, man, the biggest news bulletin about this entire Cotton Bowl event, the fact that they doubled their audience compared to last year, but the card is just so mid. You know, there were a couple hot angles last week with Sunshine, and that was about it. This week was just kind of meh. You know, the tape fist match didn't really do a whole lot for me. For the fans, they liked it. So I guess it's the classic Dave Meltzer argument. Well, it worked for the room. It just didn't work for me, brother. Trademark. But we'll see. I'm expecting at least one more round of Cotton Bowl footage before the next set of Dallas tapings. So we'll see if they turn it around at the end. And they better not fucking false advertise me. I want to see some bald-headed geeks next week, as Paul Jones would coin. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in to watch the Friday podcast. This coming Monday, we've got the WWF In Your House show, as well as the Retro Raw follow-up. And then that should round out a solid, thorough, hour-long Monday podcast. So, yeah, that's all I got for this one. Take care, everybody. Peace out.